Welcome to War Room, the official podcast of the U.S. Army War College online journal, graciously supported by the Army War College Foundation. Please join the conversation at warroom.armywarcollege.edu. We hope you enjoy the program.
Make sure not to miss a single podcast and subscribe to A Better Peace, the War Room podcast, at iTunes, Google Play, or your favorite subscription service. The views expressed in this presentation are those of the speakers and do not necessarily reflect those of the U.S. Army War College, U.S. Army, or Department of Defense.
Welcome to A Better Peace, the War Room podcast. I'm Ron Granieri, Professor of History at the Department of National Security and Strategy at the U.S. Army War College and podcast editor of the War Room. It's a pleasure to have you with us. From 10 to 12 May 2022, the U.S. Army War College hosted the first annual Strategic Landpower Symposium. According to its official report, the symposium aimed to advance the concepts surrounding the role of strategic land power in cooperation, competition, integrated deterrence, and joint all-domain operations. Bringing together students, scholars, and practitioners, the symposium displayed original research and presented solutions to senior leaders about how land power can help achieve national objectives in the future. As part of the symposium, Army leadership had asked the United States Army War College Strategic Land Power Integrated Research Project faculty to address the future role of strategic land power. Taking up that challenge, 7 members of the U.S. Army War College class of 2022 participated in the Integrated Research Project as part of their Master's in Strategic Studies degree research requirement and presented their results at the symposium. To amplify their work, A Better Peace has organized 2 podcast sessions with those students to discuss their projects, their relationship to the Strategic Land Power Symposium, and possible implications for the future of U.S. security policy. This is the first of 2 sessions, and today's topic is Shaping the Theater with Lieutenant Colonel Phil Baker, Colonel Greg Foxx, Mr. Kirk Sanders, and Colonel Carl Zeppengno. Lieutenant Colonel Phil Baker is an Army engineer with the North Dakota Army National Guard with 34 years of combined service. Prior to the War College, Colonel Baker was battalion commander of the 164th Engineer Battalion. His next assignment is garrison commander at the Camp Grafton Training Center in North Dakota. Colonel Greg Foxx is a psychological operations officer with extensive experience in key PSYOP positions, including detachment commander, company commander, battalion executive officer and commander, and group operations officer, executive officer, and deputy commander. His operational assignments include peacekeeping operations in Kosovo, support to Special Operations Command Pacific, and multiple combat deployments to Iraq and Afghanistan. Mr. Kirk A. Sanders is with the Defense Intelligence Agency, is a retired Army lieutenant colonel. He's currently a student at the U.S. Army War College, but he's also already received a master's degree in strategic intelligence from the Joint Military Intelligence College and is a fellow from the Harvard University Kennedy School of Government as a senior executive fellow. He had a 24-year career in the Army, and prior to his arrival at Carlisle Barracks, he served at the U.S. Indo-Pacific Command as the Deputy Chief, J2C ISR Operations Division. And finally, Lieutenant Colonel Carl Zeppengno is an intelligence officer in the United States Marine Corps. Throughout his career, he had been deployed 5 times to Afghanistan with infantry units as a targeting officer, an intelligence officer, and working with strategic intelligence. He has spent the last 10 years working with defense and strategic human intelligence and was assigned to the U.S. Embassy in Nairobi, Kenya from 2012 to 2015. Upon graduation, he will assume the duties as the senior Marine at the Defense Intelligence Agency. Welcome to A Better Peace, gentlemen.
Thanks.
You bet. And I'd like to give you each a chance to summarize for the audience your research. We'll go in alphabetical order. So I'd like to start with you, Phil Baker.
Thank you. So when I did my research, I was researching on how the state partnership program can assist in helping geographic combatant commanders reach their goals in the Army's new operating concept of multi-domain operation. And with this, there were 4 key things that I saw that came out of the research, and I'd like to share that with you. And the first one is that the state partnership program helps geographic commanders to set the theater by building long-term and lasting relationships between the United States and partner nations within their theater. These are small footprint, big impact engagements, and they enhance the capability and the trust between the nations. And in turn, the resulting strategic access and influence is both effectual and resilient. In this case, I think about one of the major concerns of every commander is access, spacing, and overflight. And the relationships that are constructed through the state partnership program significantly enhance the likelihood of these access. The second point that I have is that from its inception, the state partnership program was designed to be used as an element that helps partner nations reform their defense and peacekeeping operations. These activities serve to bolster the nation's techniques, tactics, and procedures for responding to and preventing issues with violent extremists, with terrorist organizations within their borders and large-scale adversaries if necessary. This peacekeeping operation or focus is something that the state partnership program excels at. A third thing is that the state partnership program actions have a unique ability at helping out host nations with crisis management or disaster management. And this is kind of a unique thing to the National Guard because the National Guard actually does a lot of that in the homeland, working with FEMA, working with the local emergency management personnel. And so the National Guard State Partnership Program brings a lot of this to the various nations, partner nations, and helps them to get better at dealing with these type of crises in their own country. And this effect makes for a more stable nation in the long run. So a more stable nation in the long run translates into a place that doesn't present itself as easy prey for like violent extremism and things of that fashion. And then finally, the final thing is that the state partnership program really helps to achieve shared security objectives in theater with coordinating activities with our allies and partners. But one of the things that the state partnership program excels in is training. And as our allies and partners take on new pieces of equipment, for example, the trainers are likely going to come from the state partnership program. But in addition to that, the partners are going to get together at least twice, 2 exercises a year, and they're going to execute in ways that are going to help the nation learn how the United States operates and help the United States learn how that nation operates. And that builds a unity, that builds some interoperability that can be leveraged by geographic commanders going forward.
That's great. Phil, I got to ask while you were, who is North Dakota's partners? Who are the North Dakota Guard? Who are your state partners?
So the North Dakota National Guard has 3 partners, all of which are in Western Africa. Ghana is our longest running partner. And then Togo and Benin, the 2 neighbors just to the east of Ghana, are also partnered with North Dakota. It's an interesting regional partnership, and it works out very well.
Great. Thank you, Phil. I was going to make an observation about the contrast in the weather between West Africa and North Dakota, but we'll save that for the subsequent Q&A. Let's go with to Colonel Greg Foxx.
Thanks, Ron. Similar to Phil and the state partnership program that he described, I came to the integrated research project with sort of an intent to describe my niche capability in the Army as a PSYOP officer, which is, of course, the cognitive domain and the information dimension of the physical domain. And how does that apply and how does that play out in the Army's new multi-domain operations concept? And what does it mean in the future of warfare that's multi-domain with land power? Why is it important? How does it fit into land power? So I went into this whole thing thinking about those things, thinking about from a psychological operations perspective, why is information and influence important? How will it be leveraged in the future of land power? And what I found was so much of multi-domain operations is focused on conventional military threat, which is to say not being outranged, not being outgunned, and being able to provide positional advantage in a theater. And of course, the Army's portion of that is the land power perspective. And a lot of that is being done through the 6 modernization equipping programs that the Army is going through. So after thinking about that and thinking about my profession and Army Special Operations Forces, Army SOF in particular, with Special Forces, Psychological Operations, and Civil Affairs, I began to think, what is it that is unique that Army SOF provides to land power and in strategic competition specifically? And I think to define that, one, you have to define what is strategic competition. What are we trying to do? And secondly, you have to understand what is victory in strategic competition. So I spent a lot of time, I think, in the IRP exploring these two concepts of strategic competition and victory in strategic competition and applying that to my craft and specifically Army Special Operations Forces and the 3 tribes that it consists of that primarily operate in that cognitive domain, the human domain, and work within information and influence. And the truth is, joint publication identifies warfare as traditional and irregular. And I've made the case that irregular warfare is primarily, it's of course the responsibility of the entire department, but the primary competencies of it reside in Special Operations Forces. And I narrowed that down to Army Special Operations Forces because they're the preponderance of the SOF force, over 50% currently. And irregular warfare is defined as counterterrorism, counterinsurgency, security force assistance, unconventional warfare, and stability operations, which include the information and civil military components that PSYOP and civil affairs contribute to. And although 2021 will likely be remembered as the year that the U.S. withdrew from Afghanistan, it was also the 30th anniversary of Desert Storm and American conventional military might and the pinnacle of course, air-land battle and that concept that made U.S. military strength, conventional strength for traditional warfare, what it is. And coming out of that, we've enjoyed that strength, but we fought a lot of things that are irregular, getting back to that irregular definition. Afghanistan and Iraq, of course, involved a lot of counterinsurgency, counterterrorism, a lot of security force assistance, gripping up with partners in Iraq and Afghanistan. And we have to believe that over the past 20 years, both the conventional force and Army SOF have developed a lot of competencies in that regard. So I've just spent the preponderance of my IRP time thinking about what is irregular warfare, why is it important in a world of great power competition where we're primarily, I argue, thinking a lot about conventional military capability. And of course, we have to think about deterrence in terms of the most dangerous, whether you're thinking about nuclear deterrence or conventional deterrence. But the truth is the most likely is often something that's unconventional, and it's something that we've had what I believe and would argue is some competence in through the past 20 years, and that's irregular warfare. And Army Special Operations Forces are at the tip of that spear. And the paper that I wrote specifically talks about how Army SOF can be used in conjunction with the Theater Army in the Pacific to provide an unconventional deterrent. So while there's nuclear deterrence, and while I argue that conventional deterrence is being focused on with MDO and with land power development, Army Special Operations can be used to work with the Theater Army to prevent some of the things that we've seen in the East and South China Sea from China, some of these fait accomplis. And that's the heart of my argument, and it plays in nicely with things like the State Guard program that Phil discusses, and also Security Force Assistance Brigade stuff that you've discussed in earlier podcasts here on the War Room, and the earlier podcast that you had on great power competition, where you've discussed the idea of how partners and allies are so important in strategic competition. I just argue that one big portion of this piece is irregular warfare, and it's critical to marrying up with conventional military might.
Thanks, Greg. That's very good. We'll come back. I have questions. We'll come back to them.
Sure.
Now I'd like to go with Kirk Sanders.
Yeah, thank you, Ron. The reason why I originally approached and looked at the Integrated Research Project as an area I could join into was, I come from Indo-PACOM in the Pacific Theater. And I was really interested, being an old Army guy, in seeing how the Army could be involved more in conducting ISR operations in the theater and being a contributor on a daily basis. But the other part was, my concern is that looking at it from a theater perspective, and I had worked with USARPAC, which is the theater Army element there in the past, is I really wanted to see kind of how the Army was looking at the new approach to theater Army, and how the theater Army would be involved in the theater. And how they would interact with the theater commands and what their plan was. So in this regard, I took a very, I guess you'd say, personal approach, looking at it from my approach as being an ISR asset manager inside the theater. That's kind of the area that I looked at. So what I really wanted to look at was the need for the U.S. Army Pacific, or USARPAC, to position ISR assets forward in the Pacific Theater. And in order to do that, they have to work with the host nation in the area they want to place either fixed assets or mobile assets or capabilities. The problem that the theater currently has is that there is a shortage of surveillance and reconnaissance assets in the Pacific Theater. And that's why I was looking at the Army maybe being a contributor, because it would be a new type of asset as opposed to just adding more of the same from the Air Force, the Navy, or the SOF forces that are currently operating in the theater. The theater itself, we're in a competition, obviously, with China, and that's kind of the pacing element, and from a national security perspective. And so what does the military contribute to that in our theater is basically force posture and forces that are operating within the theater in the military realm. ISR assets are part of that. And as we operate the ISR assets, we see that there are gaps in both the collection that we're currently conducting, and there's also the part where we don't have persistency on areas that we really want to have persistent coverage on. And so in looking at that, we wanted to see if there was capabilities out there that could do that. And my proposal in the paper was that the U.S. Army may be able to provide capabilities from fixed sites or other locations. Let's think about in the box and out of the box of the way we had previously operated, to say what kind of capabilities can we field, especially looking into the South China Sea and those areas where there are island chains around there where we have partners and host nations we may be able to work with to make that happen. So the rationale that I looked at for why USARPAC could place assets in the theater would be, they're going to look at aligning their capabilities with the national and Indo-PACOM strategies. National strategy is, we want to look at and pivot towards more of looking at China. We need to have more, and from a theater perspective is we need more ISR capabilities. Our theater combatant commander has gone repeatedly to Congress and said, I need more ISR assets and I need more capability in my theater to do what I really need to do against my adversaries in the theater. So that would be one area where we would see as USARPAC would look at that as aligning some forces to do that. The second area that I thought that from a ISR contribution perspective would be setting up the theater and starting to put assets into the theater that would support the multi-domain operational concepts in the out years from the Army concept. So as the Army looks to develop its strategies to provide a mix of forces forward, and we're talking missiles, fires, EW, I also put in the proposal to say you also should be considering the ISR assets forward as part of that mix. And that's really where you can start gathering intelligence in the competition phases before you get to conflict. But you can also transition and look at, as you're placing these ISR assets in there, is how you would transition to a conflict and where you need to have those to support what would be the fires and other capabilities we would want to employ under multi-domain operations. So how do we do that? Because now we've identified in the paper and say, hey, there's a need. So now how do we do that? So the second part of my paper looked at that the USARPAC as a theater army needs to develop what would be the internal staffing effort to look at engagements, to look at operations, to look at ISR as how we package that together to work with host nation and partner nations to facilitate, employment of our capabilities in the theater. So who do they have to work with? Well, they work internally to get their own staffing process together, but then they have to work with the theater. They have to work with what would be outside agencies and other partners from the U.S. government side. And this includes the U.S. Embassy, who is basically the kind of the first entry into, working with the host nation or partner nation, is working with the State Department and the U.S. Embassy to facilitate that type of activity. The other part that I saw as being key to working with the host nation and partner nation for this is what is the benefit that we're going to provide, or what benefits can we derive in this in working with the host nation and partner nation. So this also goes along with the Army strategy and the theater strategy, is we're looking for building interoperability with our host nation and partner nations. And we're also looking at the ability to share information freely between either bilateral relationships or even expanded to multilateral, national sharing of information. And so this particular ISR can facilitate or maybe a way to facilitate doing that information sharing, because if you bring in an asset that can provide something that the host nation itself can't afford or can't provide, then you're giving them added benefit. You're looking at sharing the information with them, and then you're also looking at building the interoperability as we talk about how we share this information theater-wide, U.S.-wide, and within the host nation and partner nation. So there's a lot of applications of that. And where you would also look at the interoperability piece is how do we train or operationalize the host nation and partner nation in that regard. And so I looked at or made the suggestion that we could look at some of these training programs we already currently conduct beyond exercises, as in, say, the Security Force Assistance Brigades, incorporating some of that training in there, or looking at, as Phil was talking about, the National Guard partnership programs, where they could also look at injecting a little bit of this intel training and utilization of information off these platforms to work it through. Now, in this part, and both part of placing an asset and then also working with the host nation and partner nations, I know there are challenges to this. And some of the challenges are the political considerations in the theater itself with these host nation and partner nations. They have to consider the sensitivities of China. So if you start to place assets into country that are U.S. and they appear to be targeted against the adversaries, China may react to that. They may react in a fashion to the host nation, or they may even take a reaction to the United States. And you'd have to have that into consideration as a challenge to placing these assets. The other one is, does the U.S. have the budget? And do we have the people within the Army to actually man or stand up these type of capabilities? So how do we get that to be a priority within the Army? Is it also getting budgeting information from theater? And then if we do so, do we get the people that we can train up with the skill sets that are required to in place and work with these assets? So those are just some of the challenges. I didn't really address the answers to those solutions in my paper. I just brought those up as, hey, these are further for consideration as you go through the staffing. So finally,
you have a career to go on. You have lots more to do. So, you can answer those going forward.
Absolutely. So the recommendation is, hey, put forward the Theater Army USARPAC, put forward a plan to start talking about and placing ISR assets forward to support the current theater now, but then also look at setting the stage for MDO operations in the future. And then also by doing so, you're also going to help to look at interoperability and working with our host nation and partner nations to provide valuable information that will give them situational awareness within the theater. So that's kind of where my paper went.
Awesome. Thank you, Kirk. That was some fascinating stuff. So we'll come back to this. The patterns that one begins to see developing, talking about dealing with allies and partners, the idea about preparing ahead of time for conflict rather than waiting for it to happen, which of course will bring us to somebody who's always ready in advance, right? I'm a Marine officer, Colonel Zeppengno, please.
Hey, thanks, Ron. And I'm looking forward to having this conversation with the panel about, I think, all of these topics. But how I approached this, the integrated research project, was taking a look at the two doctrines that will basically implement how the Army and the Marine Corps will apply land power in both a competition sense and a conflict sense. And those two doctrinal ideas are the Army's multi-domain operations and the Marine Corps' expeditionary advanced base operations. Now, both of those ideas, or both of those concepts, are rooted in addressing both of our peer competitors' anti-access area denial capabilities, right? Our adversaries are trying to make it so difficult for us to get into an area of operations and make it so costly that we don't even try, right? Which would affects our coercive capabilities and force deployment. But that's not the only thing that's going to impact the United States' ability to force project and get involved in coercive efforts around the world. When you start looking at the advanced analytical capabilities with the data that's available now and over the next 10 years, the counterintelligence and operational security risks based on an adversary's ability to analyze, assess, spot data based on individuals' facial recognition, their online patterns, their cellular data, where they're going, and compile all this data. An adversary can start building a true understanding of not only individual capabilities, but when you start layering that on top of what units are doing and how units deploy and the readiness and those kinds of things, you can get a very good understanding of how the United States intends to employ its assets, where they're at, how they move throughout a theater of operations. And if an adversary like China is able to dominate the 5G space, the Internet of Things could make it very difficult for the United States to employ its capabilities. So for like the Marine Corps, the Commandant of the Marine Corps wants to have Marines operating in a contested space that in ways that look very similar to covert efforts to communicate and stay underneath the radar. However, because of the ubiquity of these signals and the capabilities that exist out there, this has a significant threat on how both the Army and the Marine Corps intend to use its people in these contested spaces. So what I took a look at was the threat that AI and advanced analytics using all of this data has on the ability for the United States to implement its MDO and EABO concepts in both conventional and irregular warfare.
So thank you, Carl, because this what you were just talking about there, and the idea that there are that there are at least two different doctrines in play, right, gets to one of the interesting questions that I think runs through all four of your topics, which is various notions of cooperation, whether we're cooperating between the United States and international allies, whether we're cooperating between branches. And Greg, I'm thinking about your discussion about the idea of finding out how we're supposed to fit special forces or special operations forces in this larger discussion of what does it mean to be ready for a conflict in advance. And so I want to ask a question of the four of you, and you can answer in any order that you want. And that is, when you were presenting your work to each other, when you were working in the IRP, how much communication and coordination did you have with each other either about your topics, but about how you approach them? Did you find that these discussions about cooperation, did they lead to greater cooperation within the IRP itself?
Well, I think as I was going through my research, it helped frame the discussions that we were having in the IRP and interactions. Right, I remember I think talking with Greg and Phil throughout the time we were going, and how it framed the different things and the things I was thinking of, especially when it comes to partner cooperation. Right, like, so the threats that exist out there aren't solely U.S., right? So all of these things, as we work with partners, whether it's through the state partnership program or in the SOFT community, and our partners, their digital tradecraft, their digital footprints can have as much impact as say a U.S. person's. So yeah, I thought it helped at least in some of our conversations. Yes.
It does, and an interesting connection here that I see is, special operations, intelligence. They're not the same, but there is a great deal of let's say from an outside perspective, right? They're related if they're not directly connected. And so, Greg, I want to ask you, right, the idea of the role of special operations forces within the theater army, within planning for these sorts of things. Where does that fit in where does special operations forces planning fit into larger military planning, right? Because is it something that is always imagined as being involved in the fight before the beginning, or is it something that's deployed after the fight has begun?
Yeah, I think you start with the competition continuum and what we were talking about earlier, from cooperation to conflict. The NDS describes the contact layer, contact, surge, different layers. And really, special operations forces, particularly when we talk about our two peer adversaries, are in the contact zone persistently, daily, engaging our partners, reinforcing our partners. And I go back to what I mentioned as something, I think it was Colonel retired Bob Jones at SOCOM had termed unconventional deterrence in a Small Wars Journal article, which is essentially providing the ability of working with our partners to where they become so adept and so capable that it becomes something too painful for our adversaries to imagine in terms of attacking or doing something that's above and beyond the threshold of conflict. And of course, there's something very different between rolling 190,000 plus troops across the border in Ukraine and a fait accompli on a rock island in the South China Sea. Again, one is probably the most dangerous course of action, and the other is probably most likely up until this time where we've seen with Ukraine. And I think the special operations forces are there persistently in theater, providing the ability to have the ability to push back and providing our partners the assurances that they need. And then when you look at a broader strategic level of setting and shaping the theater, that ability to be in theater and be gripped up with partners amplifies everything within multi-domain operations, from long-range precision fires to understanding the environment. So much of what we've been discussing is kill chain. Understand, decide, and act, whether it's intelligence, surveillance, and reconnaissance, or the enemy using our own footprints in a digital environment against us from fort to port, as we've described it. So much of that, I think, SOF's ability to work with partners day in and day out and conventionally constantly engage in theater is important.
And
hey, Greg,
you know what?
If you
go ahead,
Carl,
sorry, please. No, go ahead, Carl.
Something Greg hinted at, and I know it just touches a bit on a lot with Kirk, but in this new environment, the need for intelligence sharing, right, and at all levels, so that like Greg talks about, hey, to make that partnership that much stronger and to be that conventional and irregular deterrent that it needs to be, we need to be able to share intelligence much more effectively, much more efficiently with our partners. I think the Ukraine conflict is demonstrating the utility there, but it also, I think, can have a deterrent effect even in the Indo-PACOM if we're able to bring our partners up to a level where they are a credible deterrent force with other peer adversaries.
Right. Well, and this, Phil, this makes me want to bring you in here too on this because we're talking a lot about Indo-PACOM and your specific expertise with the North Dakota Guard and with the state partnership is in West Africa. But the idea of how does cooperation with partner forces, right? In what ways? Is there a standard template that is followed, whether your partner is in Benin or Belize? Is there, and what kind of information sharing, what kind of common training goes through the various National Guard units so that we can use those partnerships to make it easier to work with partners, no matter what region they are in?
Sure, great question. One of the problems, and I don't know if that's the right word to use, but one of the hindrances that the state partnership program actually has is that unlike in the military where we'll have a geographic combatant commander, somebody who's over Indo-PACOM, all of those nations have a chief of mission, an individual chief of mission appointed by the president, an ambassador. So there's instead of one boss that's over the Indo-PACOM, there's 54 bosses, right, that are over each individual nation in there. So there's a challenge there. And one of the ways that we get around that challenge, and it's starting to happen more, although I wish it would be a lot more prevalent, but where the geographic combatant commander holds a conference basically and says this is the direction that I'd like us to go in. Now, honestly, most nations, most Department of State personnel are on board and they want to do that. But everybody's got their agenda. Everybody has something that they're trying to do, and it doesn't always line up. So the answer to the question is, I wish there was a simple answer. The challenge is that we need to meet, the Department of State's needs, the Department of Defense's needs, the host nations need, right, because they get a voice in this as well, and as well as each of the individual states that are in there. So with a guiding vision from the geographic combatant commander that is pressed forward as saying, hey, this is the direction I would like us to go in. If that happens in a one setting where we're at least in-house, I mean in the United States, where the Department of State and Department of Defense are together in the direction that we're going in, then we can work that with the host nation partners to achieve that objective. Sometimes it's easy, and sometimes it depends. Great work.
Right. The Great War College answer. That's right. Well, that actually makes a lot of sense. Well, and speaking of complex relationships, Kirk, I want to shift over to you, to the idea that you retired from the Army and moved from one corridor to another in the Pentagon, and so now you're at the DIA. But I am curious how you feel about the way that DIA interacts with other agencies, both within the military branches, but also just other agencies within the government as a whole, to develop effective strategies and to create synergies with capabilities and plans so that we can be ready for the kind of complex situations that we would face in some place like Indo-PACOM.
Sure. I think, to initially begin with, is DIA somewhere around in the 2007, 2008 timeframe, took over ownership of what would be the component commands, the theater commands, intel elements. So all the J2 shops fell underneath DIA. So that's predominantly where I've worked. But from that, we work significantly with what would be our, the mothership that is back in DC, And I've been at AFRICOM and I've been at UCOM, well, actually AFRICOM and PACOM, both as DIA employees. And before that, I worked at UCOM as in military uniform. But the idea is that the DIA folks there, working with the DIA folks back in DC, have a good, strong relationship where they're communicating back and forth. And I think that's grown over the years from the 2008 timeframe on forward. But also the Intel community since 9/11 has had a lot of soul searching and a lot of looks on their perspective to actually, how do we do things better and how do we become a much more better integrated capability for the nation. So there's a significant interaction between what would be the agencies from a national perspective to support the theaters. You see a lot of representation down in the theaters from these particular agencies. DIA is always there because, of course, we're the J2 backbone, but you'll see, folks from NGA and other agencies that are there to provide and facilitate that. What is unique, I think, from the DIA Intel perspective at the J2 is we're doing the daily operational missions for the theater and providing them analytically to the theater commander. So it was interesting when Greg mentioned the part about a presence and how we work in a competitive environment. The intel from a perspective in that regard, from the theater and DIA's part of that, is constantly looking at the daily interaction and missions that need to be conducted in that regard. So that's why you want to see the components from those theaters being decisively engaged. And you do in the ISR realm is you see a very joint effort in all the theaters to kind of bring as many ISR surveillance intel capability to bear in the theater to provide the theater commander with basically situational awareness of what's going on. The other part that sometimes especially when you see big gray platforms out there from the Air Force or the Navy or whatever, the presence itself also becomes I guess you'd say, a different mission category. It's a deterrence as well as a presence that shows the adversary they're being observed. There's somebody here that cares and that we're going to conduct operations in these areas so that not only are we have a situational awareness, but we're also letting them know that we're there and we do care about those particular environments. So that whole part of that competition phase for presence, ISR plays a key part in that regard. So that's where I see that. And the info sharing part, especially in our theater, and especially sometimes you'll find it in the AFRICOM theater and other theaters, is it plays a key part in really working with host nation and partner nations and making interoperability a lot better.
Right. And I guess since we're just about out of time for this conversation, we just scratched the surface on your topics, but the overall idea that it's not only creating these sort of partnerships and these connections and drawing these larger being aware of the situation is something that one not only has to do, but one should be seen to be doing. So seen by your partners so that you know that you're engaged, and seen by the adversary so that the adversary knows that you're really there. I would be remiss as a member of the faculty of the School of Strategic Landpower if I didn't say this is why it's so important to actually be on the ground, because that's how people see you. If you're not on the ground, they can't see you. I hope that you all enjoyed and profited from the experience in the symposium in the IRP. I'm sure you did, as you've been wrapping up your time as students here at the War College. I thank you for coming here on A Better Peace to give us a taste of the kind of work that students do at the War College and the kind of work that you did in the IRP and in the symposium. And I wish you all luck going forward. Thanks very much, Phil Baker, Greg Foxx, Kirk Sanders, and Carl Zeppengno for joining us today on A Better Peace.
Thank you.
Thanks, Ron.
Thanks for having us.
Thanks, Ron.
And thanks very much for all of you for listening in. Please send us your suggestions and your comments on this program and all other programs, ideas for future programs. We're always interested in hearing from you. Please subscribe to A Better Peace on your podcatcher of choice, because that's how other people can find out about us, especially if you rate and review us. We are always interested in widening the community for these kinds of conversations, and we look forward to welcoming you all to the next one. And so until next time, from the War Room, I'm Ron Granieri.
And that concludes our program. Thank you for listening. The views expressed in this podcast reflect those of the speakers and do not necessarily reflect the views, policies, or positions of the U.S. Army or the Department of Defense. Let us know what you think. Provide us your feedback, comments, or suggestions through our webpage at warroom.armywarcollege.edu. And have a great day.